Mississippi River is a slow brown god. It gives and it takes, its murky waters holding secrets as old as the continent itself. On the 9th of November 2018, near the small, sleepy town of Port Gibson, Mississippi, it decided to give one of its secrets back. An old fisherman named Silas Jones, a man whose face was a road map of 60 years on the water, was checking his trot lines when he saw it. A pale shape, bobbing in the current, caught against a tangle of driftwood. He steered his flat-bottomed boat closer, his heart a cold knot in his chest. He'd seen his share of strange things pulled from the river, but he knew with the grim certainty of experience that this was no log, it was a body. He called the Claiborne County Sheriff's Department. The response was swift. A team of deputies and a crime scene unit met Silas at the muddy bank where he'd managed to tow his grim discovery. The preliminary examination was done right there under the gray, overcast sky. The victim was a woman. Her body was a canvas of horrific injuries concentrated on her head. Her arms were covered in dark, ugly bruises. Her limbs were bound tightly with nylon rope. The body was bloated in an advanced state of decomposition. This wasn't an accident. This was a murder, a premeditated, brutal execution. There were no personal items on her, no wallet, no ID, nothing to give her a name. The only clues to her life were on her body. Her hands were soft and smooth, the nails neatly manicured. She wasn't a manual laborer. Her clothes, though waterlogged and torn, were fashionable. A brand-name jacket, designer jeans. Around her neck she wore a delicate gold chain with a small jade Buddha pendant. In her ears were simple gold stud earrings. Her valuables were still on her. This wasn't a robbery. This was personal. This was rage. The body was transported to the state forensic lab in Jackson. The full autopsy report painted a picture of unspeakable cruelty. The decomposition was severe. Hair, nails, and sections of her scalp were detaching. Her internal organs were in a state of decay. But the forensic pathologist found one crucial, damning fact. There was no water in her lungs, no signs of drowning. She had died before she ever hit the river. The small amount of water in her stomach had likely seeped in after death. The time of death was estimated to be about 7 days before she was found. She was a woman, aged somewhere between 40 and 50. She was short, only about 4 feet 8 inches tall. The cause of death was multiple stab wounds to the chest. But that wasn't all. She had also been beaten with a blunt object, causing the bruises and contusions on her arms and head. And then, after she was already dead, the killer had taken a knife to her face. Dozens of cuts, horizontal, vertical, some shallow, some deep, had rendered her features unrecognizable. It was a deliberate, savage act of desecration. The killer hadn't just wanted her dead. He had wanted to erase her identity. The initial profile was grim but clear. Police suspected a crime of passion. The suspect was likely a male, someone with a complicated, volatile relationship with the victim. The murder hadn't happened by the river. It had happened in an enclosed space, a room where the killer had the time to beat and torture his victim before finally ending her life. Then, he had disfigured her, bound her, and dumped her in the slow, dark waters of the Mississippi, hoping she would disappear forever. But the river had given her back, and she had one last secret to tell. Despite the decomposition, the forensics team managed to lift a partial fingerprint from one of her fingers. They also extracted a viable DNA sample. On November 10th, they ran the print through the national database. They got a hit. The victim had a name. Her name was Renee Lang, and she had a record, a minor one, for disturbing the public peace. The investigation now had a name, and it led them to a small rundown house in a forgotten corner of Port Gibson. Renee Lang, they discovered, had a life as murky and turbulent as the river she was found in. She had a reputation. A few years back, she had been living rent-free in a house owned by an elderly man. The arrangement had sparked a storm of gossip in the small town, rumors of an improper relationship. When Renee caught wind of the whispers, she didn't just get angry. She exploded. She had physically assaulted several of the women she suspected of spreading the rumors, a brawl so violent that the police had to be called to break it up. Her relatives and neighbors painted a picture of a woman with a fiery temper and a social life that was a tangled mess of relationships. She was a difficult woman, a woman who made enemies easily. The list of potential suspects was long and complicated, but one name immediately rose to the top: her own brother, Robert Lang. The police records showed that Robert had called the sheriff's department on his sister multiple times over the years, reporting that she had assaulted him. Their relationship was a long-running war, punctuated by screaming matches and physical altercations. But there was another, more damning fact. Renee Lang had been dead for at least a week, and her family had never reported her missing. Robert Lang became the prime suspect. Two detectives drove out to his house, a dilapidated shack on the edge of town that seemed to be held together by rust and sheer willpower. The yard was a mess of weeds and discarded junk. Inside, the house was filthy. In a back room, they found Robert's mother, a frail, elderly woman who was both deaf and blind. She was lost in her own silent, dark world, unable to provide any information. In the backyard was a small, ramshackle shed. This, they learned, was where Renee stayed when she visited. The shed was even messier than the house, a clear sign of the strained relationship she had with her family. Robert Lang returned home while the detectives were still there. They began questioning him on the spot. He was surprisingly calm, cooperative. He didn't deny his turbulent relationship with his sister. He admitted to the constant arguments, the physical fights, but he insisted he had no reason to kill her. Their fights were just that, he said, fights, never anything more. He answered their questions without hesitation. He offered to cooperate fully with the investigation. He had an alibi. For the entire week that Renee had been missing, he had either been at home caring for his mother or out drinking and playing poker with a group of friends who could all vouch for him. With no evidence to hold him on and a solid alibi, the detectives were forced to rule Robert Lang out as a suspect. The investigation had hit a wall. But before they left, Robert gave them a new name, a crucial lead. The last time he had seen his sister, she was with her boyfriend, a man named Trey. Robert didn't know his last name. He didn't know much about him at all. All he knew was that Trey had not reported Renee missing, had not contacted the family, had simply vanished from the picture. Robert's lack of knowledge about Trey was born of his own violent encounter with the man. He had seen Trey once when he'd come to the house with Renee. Robert said Trey had looked at his deaf and blind mother with an expression of pure contempt. The disrespect had sent Robert into a rage. He'd gotten into a fistfight with Trey, and after that, he had deleted the man's number from his phone, wanting nothing more to do with him. The detectives were at a dead end. How could they find a man named Trey with no last name and no phone number? The break came from an unexpected source, Robert's eldest daughter. Renee, it turned out, often used her niece's phone to make calls. The detectives checked the phone's call history. And there he was, a man named Trey, a number they could trace. The phone was registered to a Trey Sherman with an address in Monroe, Louisiana. The investigation suddenly crossed state lines. Detectives in Monroe pulled travel records. They found that Renee Lang had taken a bus to Monroe in mid-October, but there was no record of her ever returning to Mississippi. The initial theory was that she had been killed in Louisiana, but that didn't fit the evidence. The forensic estimate was that she had been dead for about a week. The distance from Monroe to Port Gibson by water was hundreds of miles. It was impossible for her body to have drifted that far in just 7 days. Then they checked surveillance footage. They found video of Trey Sherman on his motorcycle, crossing the bridge from Louisiana into Mississippi. Renee was on the back. This was after her bus trip to Monroe. He had brought her back. Further investigation of traffic cameras showed Trey returning to Monroe alone a few days later. He had dropped Renee off in Port Gibson and gone back home, and he had not returned to Mississippi during the time of her murder. Trey Sherman had a rock-solid alibi. He was in another state. He too was eliminated as a suspect. The case was now at a complete and total deadlock. The investigators were back at square one. They decided to re-examine the timeline. The last confirmed sighting of Renee was on November 2nd. The forensic report estimated she had been dead for about a week when she was found on the 9th. The math was simple. November 2nd was the most likely day of the murder. They decided to refocus their investigation. Who was in contact with Renee Lang on or around November 2nd? They pulled her phone records. 2 names popped up. A woman named Tina, who was Renee's best friend, and a man named Leo, the owner of a local tea house where Renee was a regular. Leo was quickly cleared. He had a good reputation in town and a solid alibi for the day in question. Tina, however, provided a crucial piece of information. She told the detectives that Renee had called her on the morning of November 2nd. She said she was going to a town called Vicksburg, about an hour north of Port Gibson. She didn't say why. Tina had been worried when Renee didn't return her calls later that day and her phone went straight to voicemail. Tina then told them something that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. She said Renee had a lot of male friends, but there was one man in particular who made her suspicious. A mystery man. Renee would sometimes borrow Tina's phone to call him. She would always speak in a low, submissive tone, the conversations brief and secretive. Tina suspected a complicated, hidden relationship. She didn't know his name, but she had his number. He was still in her call history. The detectives traced the number. The phone was registered to a man named Samuel, and the address listed on the registration was in Vicksburg, Mississippi. The pieces were starting to click into place. They drove to Vicksburg, to the address listed for Samuel, but when they got there, they found a man who was severely mentally disabled. He had been bedridden since childhood, unable to speak or communicate. His family told the police that his wallet, with his ID, had been stolen years ago. The detectives realized they were dealing with identity theft. Someone had used this poor man's stolen ID to register a burner phone. The case seemed to have hit another wall. But then, a veteran detective on the team, a man named Frank Miller, looked at the phone number. He recognized it. It belonged to a man he had arrested a few years back for illegal fishing on the Mississippi. A man named Dwayne Hall. Dwayne Hall immediately became the #1 suspect. They went to Dwayne's house. It was a small, neat bungalow on a quiet street. His brother, who was also mentally disabled, was sitting on the front porch. As the detectives approached, the brother began to babble and make a strange, repeated pushing motion with his hands, as if he were pushing a cart. It was a bizarre, unsettling gesture, a pantomime that seemed to hold some hidden meaning. Dwayne's bedroom was locked. The detectives kicked in the door. They found him inside. He was packing a bag. When he saw the police, he panicked. He started shouting, his voice high and shrill. "It wasn't me. I didn't do it. I don't know anything. I'm innocent." His denial was too fast, too loud. It screamed of guilt. A search of his house revealed suspicious dark brown spots on the floor of his bedroom. At first they thought it was blood. Later, tests would show it was just paint. But his kitchen was unnervingly clean. Too clean, as if it had been scrubbed down with bleach. Under questioning, Dwayne Hall confessed, but not to murder. He admitted to having a sexual relationship with Renee Lang. He said she was a prostitute and that he had been her client for the past 2 years. He also admitted that he sometimes acted as a kind of informal pimp for her, introducing her to other men without taking a commission. He said that on November 1st, the day before she disappeared, he had introduced her to a friend of his, a colleague from the factory where he worked, a man named Todd Casey. The investigation had a new, final target. The detectives went to find Todd Casey. They found him at his job at the local chemical plant. When they told him they wanted to talk to him about Renee Lang, he denied knowing her. He became aggressive, hostile when they asked to see his phone. The lead detective, feeling a surge of intuition, made a risky call. He knew it was a potential violation of privacy, but he ordered his team to seize the phone. A quick search of the call history revealed the truth. Renee Lang's number was there. Todd Casey's face went pale. He became visibly agitated, but still, he denied everything. At the same time, another team of detectives was executing a search warrant at Todd Casey's house. Dwayne Hall's house had been a dead end, the brown spots just paint, but Todd Casey's house was a treasure trove of forensic evidence. On a light switch in the bedroom, they found a bloody fingerprint. On the floor, which had been meticulously cleaned, they found tiny, microscopic droplets of blood that had spattered onto the baseboards. On the rough-hewn cement wall of his garage, they found more. The lab rushed the analysis. All of the biological samples belonged to Renee Lang. Faced with the overwhelming, irrefutable evidence, Todd Casey's wall of denial crumbled. He confessed. He told them everything. On the night of November 2nd, 2018, he had called Renee Lang. He had been introduced to her by Dwayne Hall. He arranged for her to come to his house. He hired her for sex. After the initial, agreed-upon service was over, he demanded more, for free. Renee refused. She demanded more money. Todd Casey became enraged. He started screaming at her, calling her a whore, a piece of trash. He started hitting her. He then grabbed a fruit knife he kept on his bedside table and began to slash at her face over and over again. He punched and kicked her in the abdomen, in the thighs, until she lost consciousness and collapsed on the floor. Then, in a final, brutal act of rage, he stabbed her multiple times in the chest, killing her. At around 2 a.m. on November 3rd, he bound her body with rope. He loaded her onto a small, 3-wheeled utility vehicle he owned. He drove to a deserted spot on the banks of the Mississippi River and dumped her body and all of her belongings into the dark, churning water. He then returned home, cleaned the crime scene with bleach, and disposed of the murder weapon in a nearby stream. He led the detectives to the stream. They recovered the knife. On May 21st, 2020, Todd Casey was sentenced to death for the murder of Renee Lang. The slow, brown god of the Mississippi had given up its secret, and in doing so had exposed a world of darkness and violence hiding just beneath the surface of a quiet southern town. The river had taken a life, but in the end, it had also delivered a grim and final form of justice.